December 7, 1944, Pacific Theater. Amidst the relentless churning vastness of the Pacific, where coral atolls bled into the turquoise sea and the air thrummed with the ceaseless drone of war, a single, tarnished geisha comb lay forgotten in the pocket of a young Japanese woman. Its mother of pearl shimmered faintly, a ghost of a life far removed from the brutal reality of her present. She was one of the many Japanese female personnel, primarily nurses and communications operators, swept up in the ferocious American advance, now prisoners of war. For years, Japan's propaganda machine had painted the Americans as barbaric, soulless demons, devoid of honor, bent on savage destruction. Yet what awaited these women in the enemy's homeland was a paradox so profound, it would shatter every indoctrinated belief, a strange, almost surreal paradise that would begin to melt their hardened resolve with something as disarmingly simple as a guard's charming wink. If you've ever questioned the true impact of propaganda or the surprising power of human connection amidst the chaos of conflict, then prepare for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II. What city are you watching from as we delve into this untold chapter? Aya Tanaka had been taught from birth that Japan was a divine nation, its emperor a living god, and its people superior to all others. America, conversely, was the epitome of all that was corrupt and evil, a nation of selfish materialists, cowardly and cruel. These weren't just words in a textbook. They were the very bedrock of her existence, ingrained through relentless indoctrination from childhood schools to the nursing academy she attended before the war, snatched her into its brutal embrace. Her family, humble farmers from Hokkaido, had sacrificed everything for the war effort, instilling in Aya an unshakable sense of duty and honor. To be captured by the Americans, she knew, was a fate worse than death itself, a profound shame that would dishonor her ancestors. When the American forces overwhelmed her field hospital in the Philippines, Aya, along with her fellow nurses, braced for the unspeakable. They had heard the whispers, seen the gruesome caricatures in propaganda posters depicting American soldiers as monstrous brutes. They expected torture, rape, public humiliation, and ultimately, a swift, brutal end. Their training had prepared them for self-sacrifice, for a valiant death rather than the indignity of capture. Yet survival had been thrust upon them, a heavy, unwanted burden. As she was herded onto an American transport ship, the rhythmic thud of the engines beneath her feet was a death knell, echoing the chilling certainty of the horrors that lay ahead. She could almost taste the metallic tang of fear and desperation in the humid air, a thick, cloying sensation that clung to her throat. The salt spray from the ocean felt like tears on her face, but she would not cry. She would not show weakness to the demons. Every fiber of her being screamed defiance, even as her body trembled with an involuntary tremor of terror. Her eyes, narrowed against the glare of the tropical sun, scanned the impassive faces of the American soldiers, searching for any hint of the monstrous cruelty she expected, convinced that their placid expressions were merely a prelude to the true savagery to come. The journey across the vast expanse of the Pacific was a blur of fear and discomfort, but not of the barbaric torment they had anticipated. Instead, there was a stark, disorienting absence of the expected cruelty. The guards were gruff, yes, but not overtly hostile. Food, though unappetizing by Japanese standards, was regular. Water was plentiful. There were no beatings, no torture, just an unsettling, almost clinical efficiency. This initial deviation from the propaganda was the first, subtle crack in Aya's rigid worldview. But the true shock came upon their arrival at the internment camp in the continental United States, a place far removed from the hellish jungles of the Pacific. Early 1945, Camp Forest, Tennessee. The women disembarked from the train, blinking against the unfamiliar crispness of the American air. Instead of the squalid, disease-ridden pens depicted in their propaganda, they found themselves staring at orderly rows of clean barracks, freshly painted, surrounded by neat, manicured lawns. The facilities were surprisingly modern, equipped with proper latrines and running water, a communal mess hall, a rudimentary infirmary, and even a small recreation area were visible. This was not the savage encampment of barbaric devils they had been taught to expect. The guards, clad in pressed uniforms, seemed Normal. They carried rifles, of course, but their faces were not contorted with hatred. Some even offered small, almost imperceptible nods. Aya's mind struggled to reconcile this image with the monstrous caricatures plastered across every Japanese propaganda leaflet. Her initial reaction was one of profound disorientation, a jolt to her very perception of reality. It was a trick, she thought, a cunning deception. They would lull them into a false sense of security before unleashing their true savagery. She clung to this belief. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only way to protect her fractured understanding of the world. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the trick never materialized. Instead, they received clean uniforms, basic toiletries, and surprisingly, hot meals served on actual plates, not slop in troughs. The food, though bland and alien, was nourishing. A specific detail, almost clinical in its precision, would later emerge from declassified records regarding this period. Camp records, Japanese female POW internment, Block C7, February 1945. Of the 43 Japanese female prisoners processed in this specific internment block, not a single one displayed signs of physical abuse from their captors upon intake. All reported adequate sustenance during transit. Initial psychological evaluations indicate pervasive distrust and adherence to Japanese military propaganda regarding American cruelty, but no overt hostility from the prisoners themselves. Aya herself, in a moment of candid self-reflection years later, would describe her internal turmoil at that time. "This is a trick. The demons wait. They must." My mind screamed it, even as my body began to yearn for the simple comfort of a clean bed, the unexpected warmth of a hot meal. It was a battle waged not with bullets, but within the very core of my soul, a desperate attempt to protect the truths I had been taught, even as those truths began to crumble under the weight of an unexpected reality. The sheer ordinariness of their captivity was, in itself, the most shocking form of psychological warfare. The first few weeks were a continuous barrage of micro-revelations, each chipping away at the reinforced walls of Aya's indoctrination. One particularly chilly evening, as the unfamiliar Tennessee wind whistled through the barracks, a guard, a young man with kind eyes and an almost boyish face, noticed Aya shivering. Without a word, he retrieved an extra woolen blanket from a supply locker and gently offered it to her. His gaze was devoid of malice, only a fleeting concern. It was a simple gesture, yet it sent a jolt through Aya. Japanese military doctrine had hammered home the notion that showing weakness invited cruelty. This American demon, however, had responded with an act of unexpected warmth. Her fellow nurses, hardened by the war, reacted with a mixture of suspicion and a quiet, almost imperceptible curiosity. Akiko, a stern senior nurse who had seen the horrors of Saipan, merely grunted, but Aya saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. The guards, on the whole, maintained a professional distance, but their interactions were consistently courteous. They addressed the women respectfully, using formal titles rather than demeaning epithets. Daily routines were established, meal times, brief periods for outdoor exercise, even access to basic hygiene supplies. The caloric intake for each prisoner, a statistic carefully maintained by the camp administration, averaged around 2,200 calories per day, a stark contrast to the starvation rations many Japanese soldiers and civilians were enduring back home or on besieged islands. From a camp administration report, March 1945, initial interactions with Japanese female POWs are marked by extreme caution and suspicion on their part, as anticipated given their likely indoctrination. However, consistent application of humane treatment protocols is beginning to yield minor improvements in their demeanor. Small gestures of courtesy by personnel, though seemingly insignificant, appear to contribute to this shift. No incidents of aggression or overt insubordination recorded. Aya's internal struggle intensified. Her mind, saturated with years of propaganda, tried to rationalize these acts of kindness as a calculated ploy. They wished to weaken us, to make us compliant, she'd tell herself, repeating the familiar mantras. Yet the persistent kindness gnawed at her certainty. She observed the guards closely, searching for the underlying malice, the hidden trap. But she found only professional civility, punctuated by those disarmingly casual, charming winks, small, non-threatening gestures from some of the younger guards, meant perhaps as a sign of benign acknowledgement, or even a fleeting, awkward attempt at friendly interaction. They were not flirtatious in a predatory sense, but rather a simple, almost clumsy expression of shared humanity, a momentary break in the formality of their roles. These winks, so utterly incongruous with the image of a bloodthirsty enemy, were profoundly unsettling, for they demanded a reevaluation of everything she thought she knew. As weeks stretched into months, the unexpected courtesy solidified into a disconcerting pattern of consistent humane treatment. One day, Aya developed a throbbing toothache. Fearful of American medical care, which propaganda claimed was primitive and designed for torture, she tried to hide her pain. However, a sharp-eyed American nurse assigned to the camp infirmary noticed her discomfort. Aya was gently but firmly escorted to the medical tent, where she was surprised to find modern equipment and a clean, albeit basic, examination room. The American dentist, a stout, kindly man with surprisingly gentle hands, efficiently addressed her ailment. The pain, which she had prepared herself to endure for weeks, was gone within an hour. This access to competent medical care, readily available and without judgment, was another profound shock. The living conditions, too, continued to defy her expectations. The barracks were regularly cleaned, blankets laundered, and fresh linens provided. Compared to the meager provisions and often unsanitary conditions that she knew were the reality for many Japanese soldiers and civilians, the camp felt almost luxurious. A declassified medical report from the camp noted, in June 1945, the overall health of the internees has significantly improved since intake. Instances of malnutrition and untreated infections, common among newly captured personnel from the Pacific Theater, have been effectively mitigated through consistent provision of adequate diet, sanitation, and medical attention. Psychological states are stabilizing, though guardedness remains prevalent. The women were also, to their astonishment, allowed to receive censored letters from home. While heavily redacted, these small fragments of their former lives were precious beyond measure. Aya received a letter from her younger sister, detailing the hardships of wartime life but assuring her of the family's prayers for her safe return. The fact that the demons allowed this communication, that they facilitated this small but crucial link to their past, struck a deep chord. It contradicted the image of an enemy bent on total annihilation, on severing all ties. A fragment from an intercepted, uncensored portion of a Japanese internal propaganda directive, found by Allied intelligence. The American foe seeks to break the spirit through isolation and cruelty. They will deny all contact, all comfort, all hope. To fall into their hands is to abandon one's family and nation forever. This propaganda, once an absolute truth, now felt like a hollow echo in the face of the letters she held. The women began to speak more openly amongst themselves, their conversations shifting from hushed whispers of fear to tentative discussions of the incongruities they observed. Akiko, the stern senior nurse, confessed one evening, "They are not as we were told. Their hands, they do not shake with hatred." The charming winks from the guards, initially dismissed as an oddity, now began to register differently. They were not mocking, nor were they predatory. They seemed almost like recognition, a fleeting acknowledgement of shared humanity, a subtle softening of the rigid lines of war. These were not the grim, faceless monsters of her nightmares. These were individuals, some young, some weary, but all displaying a professionalism that slowly chipped away at the edifice of hate she had built. Aya found herself, against her will, returning a faint, almost involuntary smile to one particularly persistent young guard named Private Miller, whose winks were always accompanied by a slight, almost shy tilt of his head. The process of de-indoctrination was subtle, incremental, almost imperceptible yet relentlessly effective. The strict protocols of humane treatment, combined with the genuine, if sometimes awkward, attempts at basic human connection from the guards, began to yield unexpected results. One afternoon, during an allowed period of outdoor exercise, Private Miller, the young guard with the persistent wink, attempted to teach a group of the women a simple English phrase, "Hello, how are you?" He pointed to himself, then to them, articulating slowly. To Aya's surprise, she found herself not only repeating the words but genuinely wanting to learn more. He would patiently repeat phrases, sometimes drawing simple pictures in the dust with a stick, his earnestness disarming. According to later reports on language acquisition among internees, by August 1945, approximately 65% of the Japanese female internees demonstrated a working knowledge of basic English phrases, enabling rudimentary communication with camp staff. This rapid assimilation of a foreign language is attributed both to their intelligence and the non-hostile learning environment provided. The document fragment that offered perhaps the most startling insight into the American approach was not a physical document found by the women, but rather an underlying ethos. Though not explicitly a psychological warfare directive targeting female POWs, the general U.S. military policy on prisoner treatment, even for combatants, emphasized adherence to Geneva Conventions and humane conduct, with an eye towards potential post-war diplomacy. This was particularly true for non-combatant personnel, like nurses. The American military understood that the image of their treatment of prisoners could have long-term strategic implications. The culmination of these daily interactions, the consistent humanity, the clean conditions, the food, the winks that evolved from strange gestures to almost friendly acknowledgments, began to foster something entirely unexpected: laughter. Tentative at first, then more frequent. The women started to share jokes even with some of the guards through rudimentary English and gestures. Aya found herself chuckling at Private Miller's clumsy attempts to use a Japanese phrase he'd clearly looked up in a phrasebook. Her internal conflict was a raging tempest. How could she laugh with the enemy? How could she feel safe? The propaganda had been so absolute, so damning, yet the reality was so utterly different. She began to see the American soldiers not as faceless demons, but as men, some young and awkward, others older and world-weary, but all, undeniably, human. The charming winks, once a symbol of the bewildering foreignness of her captors, now felt like a bridge, a tiny crack in the wall of enmity, inviting her to peer into a world where perhaps, just perhaps, not everything was as black and white as she had been led to believe. The true revelation, the one that irrevocably flipped all her assumptions, came during an informal discussion one sweltering afternoon in July 1945. The women were gathered in the shade of a makeshift awning, attempting to escape the oppressive heat. The war still raged, but news of mounting Japanese losses had begun to filter through, alongside increasingly dire rumors of the state of their homeland. Hope was a fading ember. Akiko, the senior nurse, usually stoic and reserved, spoke in a low voice, her gaze distant. "I remember the propaganda before Saipan," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "They said the Americans would parade us naked, torture us for information, then murder us. That it was honorable to die by our own hand rather than suffer such a fate." A ripple of murmurs went through the group. Many had internalized the same fears, the same directives for self-destruction. Then, a younger nurse named Hana, barely out of her teens, spoke up, her voice tinged with a raw, undeniable anger. "But it's not true, is it? They gave me medicine for my fever, they gave me shoes. Shoes! When my family at home probably has rags. They are not devils." Her voice broke, a mix of relief and fury at the betrayal of her own government. It was in that moment, witnessing Hana's raw anguish and Akiko's quiet acknowledgement, that Aya felt a profound, seismic shift within her. The carefully constructed edifice of her beliefs crumbled with startling speed. The demons had not only not tortured them, but they had clothed them, fed them, healed them. They had shown them basic, undeniable human decency. The stark contrast between the prophesied hell and the experienced reality was too vast, too absolute to ignore any longer. It was not a trick. It was simply the truth. The American guards, with their awkward English, their quiet professionalism, and their surprisingly gentle, charming winks, had inadvertently become the most potent weapon against the very propaganda that had sought to dehumanize them. Aya felt a strange, dizzying sensation, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly vanished. The world she had known, the rigid black and white world of righteous Japan versus barbaric America, was suddenly bathed in shades of gray. Her own military, her own government had lied to her. They had instilled a terror of an enemy that, while certainly fierce in battle, was capable of profound acts of humanity. The realization wasn't just about the Americans. It was about the profound deception she had endured. A profound sense of release, mixed with a bitter resentment, washed over her. It was in that profound moment of clarity, amidst the heat and the quiet murmurs of her fellow prisoners, that the words, though unspoken, solidified in her mind. A quiet, defiant echo against the lies she had been fed. America is a paradise. Not a paradise of luxury or freedom, but a paradise of unexpected, life-affirming humanity. Compared to the horrific expectations she had carried for so long, it was a paradise forged in the absence of the predicted hell, a haven from the very ideology that had prepared her for absolute despair. This was the midpoint twist not of a strategic battle, but of her very soul. The psychological impact of this cognitive dissonance, the chasm between ingrained propaganda and lived experience, was immense. For the Japanese female POWs, conditioned from childhood to believe in an enemy utterly devoid of morality, the consistent humane treatment they received presented a profound ethical and psychological dilemma. Their entire worldview, their sense of honor, and even their national identity were intrinsically linked to the demonization of the Allied forces, particularly the Americans. To accept kindness from such an enemy was, in a twisted sense, a betrayal of their own people, their emperor, and the fallen soldiers they had served. The U.S. policy, while rooted in the Geneva Conventions and a pragmatic understanding of international law, also inadvertently leveraged a powerful psychological weapon. By treating prisoners humanely, even respectfully, the Americans were not just adhering to legal obligations, they were dismantling the enemy's ideological framework from within. These women were not subjected to torture or starvation. Instead, they were given medical care, adequate food, and even opportunities for recreation and basic education. This was a deliberate, albeit sometimes implicit strategy to demonstrate the superiority of American democratic values over the totalitarian doctrines of the Axis powers. Consider the psychological stakes. These women had been prepared to die for their nation, to endure unspeakable suffering if captured. The absence of that suffering, replaced by unexpected decency, forced a painful reevaluation of their core beliefs. The concept of Bushido, the samurai code emphasizing honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, had taught them that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, and that enemy captors were inherently dishonorable. Yet here were their captors, behaving with a level of honor and respect that many Japanese soldiers, particularly towards those they captured, often failed to demonstrate. This paradox created a profound internal conflict, a kind of moral injury. A post-war sociological study on former Japanese POWs, though primarily focused on male combatants, its psychological findings resonate. The reintegration of many Japanese POWs was complicated by severe cognitive dissonance. Their survival, particularly when treated humanely by the inhumane enemy, often led to feelings of guilt and disillusionment with the propaganda they had internalized. This psychological shift, while sometimes painful, frequently facilitated a more nuanced and less nationalistic worldview upon their return to Japan. The charming winks from the guards, initially dismissed as an oddity or a simple, fleeting expression, actually played a crucial role in this psychological shift. They were not grand gestures of peace, but rather micro-expressions of humanity, a brief, non-verbal acknowledgement that crossed the divide of language, culture, and war. They softened the image of the enemy by stripping away the layers of monstrous caricature, revealing individual men capable of simple human interaction. These small acts of warmth, reiterated daily, slowly but surely eroded the foundations of hatred. The outcome was a gradual, often agonizing rehumanization of the enemy in the eyes of the Japanese prisoners. They began to see the guards not as a monolithic force of evil, but as individuals, some stern, some kind, some simply doing their duty. This process of individualization was critical. It broke down the collective, dehumanized image propagated by their own government and allowed for the emergence of empathy and understanding. The "America is a paradise" sentiment, born of the absence of expected horrors, evolved into a deeper, more complex understanding of human nature itself, that even in the brutal theater of war, pockets of decency and shared humanity could and did exist. It was a profound lesson learned not through lectures or re-education, but through lived experience and the quiet, persistent kindness of their captors. The ultimate battle for Aya and her fellow internees was not fought with bullets, but with the insidious grip of deeply ingrained ideology. The climax of their internal transformation came during a period of heightened tension, just weeks before the war's dramatic end. Rumors, increasingly frantic, painted a picture of utter devastation in Japan. The women huddled together, their fear palpable, their hopes flickering. It was a time when the propaganda, which had promised divine intervention and ultimate victory, felt like a cruel mockery. Against this backdrop of despair, the camp administration, recognizing the growing unrest and psychological strain, decided to allow a unique cultural exchange. A small, carefully supervised initiative, it was designed to provide a much-needed outlet for the internees, while subtly reinforcing the message of shared humanity. The women were offered the opportunity to present aspects of their culture to the camp staff, perhaps a traditional song, a dance, or a display of calligraphy. Many were hesitant, seeing it as another form of manipulation, a degradation of their culture before the enemy. Aya felt the familiar knot of fear and apprehension in her stomach. To perform for the Americans, it felt like an act of capitulation, a final surrender of her spirit. Akiko initially refused, citing disrespect. But then Hana, the younger nurse who had vocalized her anger at the propaganda, spoke up with surprising conviction. "We show them our Japan," she asserted, her voice trembling but firm. "Not the Japan of their caricatures, nor the Japan of our false promises. Our true Japan of beauty and art." Aya watched Hana, a flicker of admiration stirring within her. It was a decision, a silent rebellion against the expectation of perpetual hatred. Aya, remembering the unexpected kindness, the medical care, and Private Miller's genuine, if sometimes clumsy, winks, made her own quiet decision. "I will participate," she announced, her voice clearer than she expected. "We will show them." She chose to demonstrate the delicate art of origami, a skill her grandmother had taught her. It was a silent act of defiance against the very notion that she should remain resentful, closed off, and perpetually hostile. Her choice was not about pleasing her captors. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself, and perhaps offering a bridge. Private Miller, standing guard that evening, felt a mix of curiosity and slight awkwardness. He'd seen the women's initial hostility, their guarded expressions. Now here they were, in their freshly laundered uniforms, preparing to perform. He remembered his orders: maintain order, but also foster an environment of respect. He'd seen the transformation in their faces over the months, the gradual softening, the tentative smiles that sometimes met his winks. He'd initially started the winks out of a naive attempt at friendliness, a way to show he wasn't a monster. Now, he felt a genuine sense of connection to these women, despite the language barrier. As Aya, with surprising grace, began to fold a delicate paper crane, her fingers moving with precision and artistry, a hush fell over the small gathering of guards. Miller watched, mesmerized by the quiet dignity of the act. He realized this wasn't just a performance. It was a revelation. It was a moment of shared humanity that transcended the brutality of the war, a silent validation of the humane treatment policy, and a profound, wordless battle won against the dehumanizing forces of conflict. The cultural gap, for a moment, simply ceased to exist, replaced by a mutual appreciation for beauty and peace. He found himself offering another, perhaps the most genuine wink of all, one of pure, unadulterated admiration and respect. This simple act of cultural exchange, of mutual observation, was the quiet climax. It wasn't a battle of bombs and bullets, but a battle for the soul, for the triumph of humanity over hatred. It validated everything the humane treatment policy had subtly built, revealing the profound truth that even the deepest ideological divides could be bridged by a commitment to respect and dignity. The war finally ended, not with the triumphant Japanese victory Aya had been promised, but with the cataclysmic horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by a swift, unconditional surrender. The news, delivered by American officers with somber faces, plunged the camp into a period of profound grief, shock, and a complex sense of relief. Japan, the divine nation, had been defeated. Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued into 1946. Aya and her fellow internees were processed for their return journey. They left Camp Forest not as the terrified, indoctrinated women who had arrived, but as profoundly changed individuals. They carried not the scars of torture, but the bewildering burden of a shattered worldview and the unexpected kindness of their former enemies. Many, like Aya, found themselves in a strange limbo, survivors of a devastating war, yet also beneficiaries of a humane treatment that contradicted everything they had been taught. Their physical health was excellent, a stark contrast to many returning Japanese soldiers or civilians from war-torn areas. Their minds, however, were a tapestry of conflicting emotions: grief for their homeland, anger at the lies they were fed, and a persistent, unsettling gratitude towards their American captors. Upon their return to a devastated Japan, these women became unwitting, unofficial cultural ambassadors. They were living proof that the American demons were not solely barbaric. Their stories, often whispered at first, then more openly as Japan slowly rebuilt and grappled with its wartime narrative, offered a counter-narrative to the pervasive propaganda. Aya, now back in Hokkaido, found it difficult to explain to her family the paradise she had experienced in captivity. Her words about kindness, good food, and respectful guards were met with disbelief, sometimes even accusation. Yet her very presence, healthy and mentally intact, spoke volumes. She became a quiet advocate for understanding, a living bridge between two nations that had been bitter enemies. She pursued a career in nursing in post-war Japan, often applying the pragmatic, patient-centered approaches she had observed in the American camp. Her experiences, and those of others like her, contributed to a gradual, if painful, shift in public perception, laying some of the subtle groundwork for future reconciliation and the strong U.S.-Japan alliance that would eventually emerge. These women, through their unexpected experiences, showed that coexistence and respect were not impossible, even after unimaginable conflict. The story of these Japanese female POWs and the humane treatment they received echoes loudly into modern military ethics and international relations. It underscores the profound and often underestimated power of human dignity, even in the crucible of war. It stands as a testament to the fact that adhering to humanitarian principles, even towards one's enemies, can yield unexpected long-term benefits, fostering reconciliation and undermining the very ideologies of hatred that fuel conflict. The simple acts of kindness, the consistent respect, and yes, even those charming winks, demonstrated that humanity could pierce through the darkest clouds of propaganda, leaving an indelible mark on the lives of those who experienced it, and offering a potent lesson for generations to come about the true nature of conflict and peace. It reminds us that empathy is not weakness, but a powerful force capable of transcending national, cultural, and ideological divides. The tale of these Japanese female POWs arriving in America, expecting a hellish ordeal, and instead finding a surprising haven of humanity, serves as a powerful testament. It's a story not just of war, but of the profound capacity for decency to emerge even in the most brutal of circumstances. It teaches us that even in war, humanity can bridge the deepest divides, proving that the truths we hold dear can sometimes be the most potent weapons, capable of shattering the most deeply ingrained lies. This narrative forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What hidden truths might we still be clinging to today, shaped by narratives we've never truly questioned? What preconceived notions, what demons of our own making, might be dismantled by a simple act of unexpected kindness? If this story has made you pause, reflect, and question the narratives that shape our understanding of history, then do not let the conversation end here. Hit that subscribe button if you want more untold stories from World War II that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history. Let's uncover these forgotten chapters together.